interpretation on things.
I really do try, and it's difficult, and it's not really what I feel like the culture is driving at. I think the culture is driving at clearly defined tribes and nuances to be eliminated. It's, you know, ends justify the means sort of thing. But I don't know how much battery time I have. I don't know how much memory I have. So I want to get the essentials of this out there. You run a school, and this is a school of Tantra.
That's correct.
A traditional school of Tantra. And for people who have never heard of Tantra before, and I'm not an expert, I haven't read the material, I've heard the word before, I have some associations in my head, but how would you define Tantra? Is it a process? Is it a goal? What is it?
It's a very good question, and it's an important question because in the West, and even now in India, Tantra is deeply misunderstood. It's often associated specifically with the New Age sacred sexuality movement, where the sex practices are deeply emphasized and are actually divorced from the original tradition of the Maithuna sex practices within Tantra Yoga. But Tantra, while it does incorporate sex practices, it is much more than that. Yoga itself is just a subset of Tantra. Tantra specifically refers to the use of material means in order to access consciousness, differing states of consciousness, as well as to explore the cosmos. And yoga is the process within Tantra of achieving unification of the self. And so, while that can include practices within sacred sexuality, the ultimate idea is to just use material means in order to bring together body, mind, and spirit, which is the tripart self within the tantric tradition.
Okay, now on your channel you discuss left wing versus, or left hand, sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself here. Left hand path versus right hand path. Is Tantra inherently left hand, or is there a split within Tantra of left hand and right hand?
Well, both paths exist within Tantra. However, you could, and I do make the argument that Tantra is ultimately a left-hand path practice because the left-hand path expresses the immanent spirit within the material world. And so there is what is called an ascending path in Tantra Yoga, which is the right-hand path, and then the descending path, which is the left-hand path. And within the ascending right-hand path, the goal is to achieve self-mastery. So it's to achieve detachment. And so that's where you have, like the Zen Buddhist tradition is a tantric tradition. And it is, the goal of that tradition is to essentially kill the ego so that you lose all attachment to the material world and you do not develop this reactivity where you are controlled by your senses, essentially. The left-hand path is the point after you reach transcendence or liberation from the material. You walk the left-hand path in order to reintegrate the material world into the self. And so that's where you get the famous left-hand path saying, turning poison into medicine. The goal is to reach a point where you have enough self-mastery that you can take things that may have destroyed you in the past and integrate them back into your life. And the ultimate goal of left-hand path Tantra is the achievement of immanence through the expression of the ego. So rather than killing the ego, you are trying to cultivate the ego and realize the self fully.
Okay, so from my reading of Eastern philosophy or Hinduism is based in Bhagavad Gita, Mahabharata, Ramayana, and the way I see this is very right-hand path. It's all about what you're saying of killing the ego, detaching, transcending to a universal attachment to God rather than the material world. What or sort of texts, or where would someone start to understand this philosophy in comparison or contradiction to those texts? What would you suggest would be a good starting point?
Well, the Tantras themselves are probably the best starting point if you want to find an ancient text that deals with these concepts. But the problem is, for one, most of them have not been translated to English. And the second problem is the translations that exist have a bias towards the Vishnu-oriented traditions or the Shiva-oriented traditions within India. So if you understand certain principles, however, of esoteric practice, which you can find outside of the Indian tradition, then you can come back into the Tantras and apply a better contextual understanding. So specifically the idea of as above, so below, and non-duality. And this is best understood actually through Nietzsche.
Okay.
Because Nietzsche is the only modern philosopher who really understood the concept of non-duality. And when he wrote about advancing beyond good and evil, what he's talking about is removing this petty moralism and finding this this monistic point that is then branched out into all creation, and recognizing that there is this immanent spirit within the material world and nothing is inherently good or inherently evil. There is just what is dharmic and what is adharmic. Now, when you specifically talk about texts like the Bhagavad Gita, if you apply the concept of as above, so below, there's an inverting principle. And this is something that's also found in the Tantras. So, for example, the Mahavidyas, which are various manifestations of Shakti, Shakti being the divine feminine and representative of the active left-hand path force within the material world, within the cosmos. There's this idea that these Mahavidyas, these aspects of Shakti, they represent taboos. And in order to worship these deities, you have to kind of invert what is morally acceptable within the culture. And this process of inversion is applied through the entire practice. So in the left-hand path, you would go into a text like the Bhagavad Gita, and you would take the moralistic arguments that are being made from the Vishnu-oriented perspective, and you'd flip them on their head, essentially. And the best way to understand this is not specifically through reading text, but just looking at the iconography, understanding the nature of the deities, developing a recognition of the energetic components of these deities, and applying this in practice. And that is when the realization of the true nature of the left-hand path is accessed.
So I guess going back to Nietzsche then, Nietzsche has a certain genealogy of morals or a historical perspective that says basically the Greeks got it right, then Plato comes along, Socrates comes along, they start thinking about universal morality, and that leads to Christianity. That's a deviation from that. Do you, in terms of history and your historical perspective, if you find that to be accurate, do you think that this inversion, reversion, or that kind of duality between these two perspectives, do you think that's a cyclical process? What kind of timescales are we talking about here? Because when I look at Nietzsche, I find it's like sort of this primeval, primordial, chaotic past that's almost infinite, and then all of a sudden there's this teleology of the Abrahamic faith that's like God created the world 6,000 years ago, it will end in 8,000 years from then, and that's the entire reality. What is your kind of almost prehistoric or historical perspective on these religious or spiritual, almost like a domination of a certain spirit in a different age? I think you reference astrology somewhat on your channel and the age that we're in. How do you map that out?
Well, within the tantric tradition, there's the concept of the yugas, or the yugic cycle. And this has been quite confused by thinkers like Julius Evola, because Evola took a very right-hand path approach with his practices and with his philosophy, and so he applied a moralistic standard for the yugas, and the idea is that the current yuga, which Evola would refer to as the Kali Yuga, is inherently bad. And so all of the confusion that has resulted with the birth of, let's say, the Abrahamic faiths, Christianity, Islam, is the result of this detachment from this essential recognition of the spirit. I take bit different approach on that. So within Vyabhra Yoga, which is the form of yoga that I developed in my yoga school, there's this split between the master age of Shiva and the master age of Shakti. And I developed this through my analysis of yogic tradition. And there's a clear split between contemplative yugas, which would be the Satya Yuga and the Treta Yuga, and then active yugas, which would be the Dwapara Yuga and the Kali Yuga. And within the contemplative yugas, so in the myths of India, you have this idea that at the Satya Yuga, everything is one. And this is the monistic point. And so this is when we all exist within God consciousness. And when we exist within God consciousness, there is no need to express any idea in the form of symbols, because everything is already understood, at least as a possibility. It's not understood in a material sense because there has not yet been a split from oneness, so there's no differentiated materialism. And then as you advance through the yuga cycles, you have a movement from the need for or the lack of a need for any symbolic understanding to the development of the mind, and then the birth of symbolic speech. And then you have an oral tradition through myth in the Dwapara Yuga, which is the age of heroes. And then now we've reached a point where we are so far away from that monistic oneness that the God consciousness or the spirit exists as a sort of whisper. Okay, and you can access it. It's an experiential thing, but it is such a difficult thing to access that you have the birth of this this philosophy, this movement of philosophy, which is essentially a profane science within Tantra. It disconnects. There's an attempt to disconnect from any type of experience outside of the mind. Everything becomes about reason and rationality, and that's where Nietzsche comes in. He recognized this tendency towards the Apollonian and this obsession with reason, which he saw as an important element, but the lack of the Dionysian element, or this active element, the divine feminine, led to the death of Greek tragedy. And so that is the point in history. It's this point where the divine feminine is abandoned, and there's this obsession with the Apollonian aspect. That is the point where we have reached, where there's this drive towards a return to oneness, a return to that spiritual aspect. Now, the thing is, because we are so far disconnected from that oneness in our current age, most people don't understand the full significance of what that means, to return to oneness. I mean, to return to God consciousness would mean to leave the age of Shakti, to leave the active age, the age of differentiated consciousness, and return to a total lack of differentiation. And that is where we find this general tendency towards creating a moralistic assessment of the world, where it's this idea of good and evil. It's this belief that one idea must be right for everyone, or one morality must be correct for everyone. The idea that it's good to dissolve all differences between people, whether that's ethnic differences, whether it's economic difference. These must all be dissolved. We must be brought into one mass, and that is where you have this tendency towards ego death. So Nietzsche, I see, is the only, or not the only, but at least the strongest modern philosopher to recognize that shifting point in the culture. And like you said properly, the Greeks, he saw the Greeks as the last real manifestation of that Shatkona culture, that combination of Shiva and Shakti, the Apollonian and Dionysian. And so my goal with my yoga school is to reintroduce people to the Shakti spirit, the Dionysian element, so that we can achieve a new balance and a recognition of the actual nature of the age that we're living in, which is not, as Evola said, an inherently bad age. It is just a specific state of time, a state of the Yuga cycle, where we happen to be at the highest point of material differentiation. And you can look at that as a negative thing, or you can look at it as a positive thing. And the perspective that you take is going to influence how you live within this world. And I choose to embrace the differentiation. I choose to embrace differentiated beauty.
So in terms of the time scale, there's a lot of different Indian perspectives on how long the yugas are. In your opinion, how far are we into the Kali Yuga? How much more do we have? Do you have an opinion on that?
No, I actually don't have a specific opinion on the actual time scale. I think that most of it is just speculation. I have no dogmatic approach to how long we are into the Kali Yuga, although I will say that we are in the age of the wolf. We are in the Kali Yuga. It's obvious the energetic nature of this age is such that there is a clear bias towards this almost profane materialism, where this scientism or a positivistic view of things, and this is, like I said, coupled with this reactionary need to return to the sun, to the monistic point. So you have these two. They seem like competing forces, but it's really all just nihilism. It's all just a rejection of the material world. One is in the form of this, as I said, positivistic, kind of like this profane relativism where, everyone says, I can't know anything. I can't know anything about the cosmos. Everything must be suspect. And then this other approach, this reactive approach that is manifesting within most major religions, is this idea that no, I can know something. I can know that I have the right answer for everyone. I know what's good for everybody, and we must return to that. So we clearly are in that age, but as far as the specific time scale, all I can say is that the nature of the yugas is such that there are minor yugas and there are major yuga cycles, and you have these cycles within your own life. So for instance, when you're in the womb, this is like a minor Satya Yuga. All the potentialities of the self exist within this womb, which is just a mirror of the cosmic womb in the monistic oneness. And when you're born, this is like the point at which this consciousness explodes into a material creation, and you start to advance through this cycle. You'll go through a spring, a summer in your life, a fall, and a winter, and it's through these cycles that we learn how to grow, develop the self, how to recognize challenges, and then how to accept death. And death is the winter period, and that is the point that we're living in now. We're living in the winter, the struggle against the idea of death. We see this death as being an immediate challenge to us, and we have to learn how to face that in order to achieve that self-realization.
What is your perspective on life after death? I'm going to guess, maybe you'll surprise me, that you have a belief in reincarnation. I don't know how strictly or dogmatically that's in, but I know Nietzsche also has the concept of eternal return, which is a little bit different. But what is your perspective on death?
So my perspective on death is a bit different from most yoga schools. I do believe in a form of reincarnation, but it's not the type of reincarnation that you would see promoted by most right-hand path yoga schools. So when you face death, what you're really facing is a dimensional shift. It is the movement from finite consciousness to infinite consciousness. And if you apply the principle of as above, so below, which is ingrained in the cosmos, you'll see that what exists in the material world will be reflected into another dimension, a more advanced dimension, a more complex, infinite expression of the cosmos. And so this is where the concept of karma comes in. When you accumulate karma in a finite existence, this is expressed upon death, where you have a shift of consciousness away from what we see as the material world to a new expression. Now, I can say this, but I don't expect anyone to accept it on faith, because the whole idea of tantric practice is it's experiential, and you need to experiment in order to have these realizations. Now, I have had realizations of the existence of states of consciousness beyond what we see in our immediate material world. And so through this exploration of consciousness, I have come to this understanding of reincarnation as being either a return to oneness, a return to God consciousness, or an infinite expression of the ego. Now that is the essential difference between someone who is totally oriented towards the right-hand path or transcendence, who wants to return to God consciousness, and someone who is oriented towards the left-hand path, who wants to preserve the ego after death, essentially achieve godhood, which is the ultimate goal of any esoteric practice that is oriented towards the left hand. Now, as I said, I don't ask anyone to accept this idea on faith. This is something that I've arrived at through many years of practice, and so I believe that this is a recognition of the nature of death is an experiential thing, and I would encourage anyone to begin to explore the concept of death by knowing the self, by knowing the cosmos, and applying the principle of as above, so below, so that they can answer those questions for themselves with a bit of guidance.
Okay. Now, what I'm kind of hearing is two different options. One is that right-hand path, you merge with Godhead. Then you've got a left-hand path, like you become a god of your own reality, which I actually think there is, maybe not in the fullness of infinite that you're talking about, but there is an indication that, for instance, at the end of Mahabharata, there's an indication that Duryodhana kind of gets his own reality to rule over. In Mormonism, this is kind of, maybe off topic, but they have a concept that if you're a righteous Mormon, you get your own planet to rule over. But what happens if you don't engage in tantric practices, you don't follow the path that you're describing, you're kind of confused, or you're pursuing the solar cult or the positivism route, then do you still just automatically get shunted into the infinite consciousness, or is there more of a more traditional reincarnation where you're stuck in this, or you go to a lower reality, or how does all that work?
Well, in order to understand the nature of reincarnation, you have to recognize the nature of the self, and that is that the spirit cannot be divorced from mind and body. The self exists as a combination of these things. So what you understand as your consciousness, you cannot, if you separate just the spirit element from your consciousness, you are no longer the same being. And so if reincarnation is to occur, so if you are to die and your spirit, which is the typical belief in reincarnation, the spirit separates from the body and then is reincarnated into a new body. This is an entirely new being, because the spirit is influenced by the body, and vice versa. The spirit influences the body. So I believe that through karmic action, through karma, you create your own heaven or hell in your life within this dimensional reality and in the next. And I am open to the potential through my exploration of consciousness that someone could develop the type of karma where they would, once they reach that dimensional shift of consciousness, that they would go on to a realm where they could continue to learn more about consciousness. But they will not be reincarnated back into this material world, because achieving that type of reincarnation, as I said, it would be like becoming an entirely new being, and then it's as if the consciousness dies. So yes, I believe that if you reach a point where you've accumulated the karma that you have not fully realized the self, I believe there is a potential that you could continue, and there are many traditions that give this indication, that you could continue to a new afterlife where you could continue to cultivate the self. This is found in the Norse tradition. There are many heavens within the Norse tradition. Valhalla is not the only end point. The same in the Greek tradition, in the Roman tradition. There are many different heavens, as well as in the Indian tradition. But what I want to emphasize to people is that if you can. What I want to emphasize to people is that if you are given the opportunity to express your ego within the age of the wolf, within the Kali Yuga, you are given a very special moment to achieve a type of heroic action that you cannot achieve under other circumstances. If you face this world of uncertainty, this period of death heroically, then you are able to express your ego in such a way in the infinite that you have achieved something that is beyond what someone may have been able to achieve if their consciousness manifested in, let's say, the Dwapara Yuga or the Treta Yuga or the Satya Yuga. And this is another thing that is found in many different traditions. It's this idea that if you live within the age of the wolf, if you witness Ragnarok, this is the opportunity to take the greatest heroic action. And so I want people to take advantage of this beautiful opportunity that they have been given to make their mark on the cosmos within such a difficult age. It's this idea of gaining pleasure through struggle. It's this idea that you will gain as much pleasure as you're willing to suffer. And if you're willing to suffer, if you're willing to face the hardship of this age, then you will express yourself in such a beautiful way in cosmic eternity that it will be worth the struggle, it will be worth the suffering. And that is why I personally believe that this Yuga cycle, the Kali Yuga, is the best Yuga to be born into. Of course, this is not, my definite judgment of the Yuga cycle. There are plenty of people who will suffer terribly within the time, and they do, within the world that we exist within. But for those who are able to rise above, I do believe that this is the best time to be alive in this dimension, and they will reap the rewards of their heroic action upon death.
So this concept of heroic action, when I think about that with respect to Nietzsche, I'm always thinking about essentially, and with reference to the Greeks of what was a hero. A hero was Odysseus, a hero was Achilles. So that kind of lifestyle, it was very much based in the body, that your heroic deeds are only given a reality insofar as they're your bodily deeds. So do you feel that all of that heroism can be achieved ritualistically through practices or sacrifices outside of these kind of world historical terms of, when I look at the Iliad or the Odyssey, I see a very political concept, not in modern left-right, but of, the city-state, of you have a certain obligation to your kingdom or to your kinsmen or whatever, and therefore whether the war is morally correct or not is not a question. It's just, is this going to enlarge our kingdom? Is this, and it is very egoic in that sense. So what does that look like in the 21st century of where, okay, yeah, we do have some states like America, Russia, China. Are we supposed to reformulate somehow ancient Greek heroism within that geopolitical context, or is it a more individualistic, ritualistic thing?
The only way to live perfectly is to live dharmically. And everyone possesses their own dharma. We're all individuated forms of consciousness. We have our own ego. We have our own nature, our own dharma. And so when I say to live heroically, I really mean to live dharmically. I mean to find your nature and cultivate it to its greatest extent. And so that could mean that you become a great warrior, or a great poet, a musician, a filmmaker, or a chef, something, anything. As long as you recognize your nature and you cultivate it fully, that is living perfectly. That is living heroically.
Good stuff. Your school, is this a school that is meant to exist kind of, how do I say this? Is there, ultimately, would you like there to be a physical building where people gather as a community? Is that meant to be a lifelong commitment ideally? Is that meant to be something scattered all over the world? Of, you know, what does the ideal vision look like for you going forward?
The ideal vision of the school is simply to take the opportunities that are exposed to us through our practice, and so that we can continue on our dharmic path. And so far, that has meant that we are working through private instruction with students all over the world. And we do not have a specific physical location, because really we feel that at this time a physical location would be a hindrance to us. We travel the United States, and soon we would plan to travel the world in order to meet with our students in their home, you know, where they practice daily, and so that we can work with them to better understand their nature, better understand what practices are relevant to them, because as I said, everyone has their own dharma, their own individuated consciousness. So we are certainly open to the possibility of someday creating a physical location where people can travel to practice. But the nature of the left-hand path is such that we wouldn't really need to have an ashram, because we don't need to separate people from the modern world. That's not our goal. We do not see, unlike most traditionalists, and we do consider ourselves traditionalists, we do not see the modern world as being some inherently evil or disgusting thing. We want to act within the modern world. We want to be a part of it, and we don't want to flee. We don't want to flee from the cities. You know, we don't want to flee from modernity. We want to give people space to practice and act yogically within whatever context is relevant to them.
Cool. All right. Well, I think that's a good note to end on. We will leave it there. Thank you very much, guys. The channel is Ride the Tiger Yoga, I believe.
That's correct.
And yeah, you can check them out there. If you like what you saw, give them a shout. Maybe join the school. But until next time, appreciate you guys. We'll see you then. Bye bye.